Welcome to episode 11 of Ty's Training Talking with My Dad. This is the week of February 24th, 2025. I'm Tyler Andrews, and I'm here as always with my co-host and wonderful father, Tim Andrews, aka Mr. C, for another look at training and life ahead of Project Himalaya. Quick favor, if you guys are enjoying this, please do all that cringy stuff, like, follow, subscribe, and maybe even most importantly, just tell someone about it. Like, I honestly just hear about podcasts from my friends. They'll say, hey, listen to this. It's great. So yeah, tell someone about it if you love it. Or if you don't love it, send us feedback on how we can do better, because we'd love to do that. But anyways, Mr. C, how are you? It's Sunday afternoon. Happy Sunday.
Thank you. I'm good. Thanks. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel now. In meteorological terms, in New England, where I live, they declare March 1st as the end of meteorological winter and the beginning of meteorological spring.
Wait, time out. Isn't the end of winter like on the equinox, the spring equinox?
That's the astronomical, the end of astronomical winter. Okay.
I didn't know there was a meteorological winter.
Yeah, I think it has to do with the amount of snow and the coldness and stuff like that. So December, January, February are the three meteorological months of winter. And then March, April, May, I guess, are spring and so on. Well, but that's, yes, we heard this on the weather on TV. It must be true.
All right. Excellent.
Makes us feel better at the very least.
There we go.
And we have some robins in our backyard, a much more sure sign that spring is coming. So nice. Yeah, it's all good right now.
Excellent.
How are you?
Great. Yeah, back in Quito, and it's eternal spring here. So it's always spring astronomically and meteorologically. No, I guess not technically, but it's basically always spring. Actually, though, it was cool. Today I was up on Ruku and there was actually snow on the summit. It rained overnight and it snowed up high. Which is not very common, so that was cool. A little bit of playing in the snow, enough to like throw a snowball, not enough to make a snow angel, but the basics. Yeah. It's cool.
Wow. Okay, well, let's dive in. First, let's get the totals.
Yeah, so it was an interesting week, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Very long week, exhausting week, tiring week, a lot of travel. I was in Europe this time last week, and now I'm here after a very short trip, and that was a lot of travel. But still somehow managed to get in a really solid week. I had 109 kilometers, 27 and a half hours of training time, and 15,067 meters of vert. So pretty solid up week. Basically able to get in almost everything that I wanted to this week. So, I definitely, it's funny. I was like writing my log today as I was preparing for this, and I was like, I'm so glad we're recording today and not yesterday, because just the difference of a couple of days makes such a difference in my mood and attitude about how things are going. And we'll dive into it, but there's like a little bit of like a dark patch there in the middle of the week where I like got back and was jet lagged and exhausted and just like so over it.
Yeah.
So anyways, let's dive into your questions, and that'll take us through it all.
I think in general, people underrate how much fatigue is brought on by travel, especially a long travel.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But okay. So welcome back. Glad you're back in Quito. It was, as you said, a quick trip to Europe, just a few days, and it's mostly off-limits subjects, but how did it go in general, and how did it impact your training?
Yeah, I mean, the trip went really well, objectively. This was Project Himalaya stuff. That's all I'm going to say about it, but went well. It was great. It was super tiring. I left Quito on... Gosh, when did I leave Quito? I left Quito last Friday night. I had like a 36-hour trip there because I had a long layover in Madrid, and then I was only in this place where we were for about 3 days, and then I had about a 20-hour trip back, and it was a lot of just like very full days, and so I was trying to squeeze in training around that. So like I was literally getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and doing like 3 hours on the treadmill. It was like maybe it was touching getting greedy a couple of times, like we talked about. But I did try to like give myself some grace there. In terms of impacting my training, like I think, I think the biggest thing was not trying to doubling in terms of like morning and afternoon sessions. Here in Quito, I'm in a very nice routine of I have my longer mountain session in the morning, and then in the afternoon I'm doing strength training and I'm on the bike and stuff like that. And it was just the days were too full and I was getting back late, and I was like, I'm not going to bother trying to do something in the evening. It's just like I'm way too exhausted. So there definitely was still some grace there that I gave myself, but I think I managed to hit the important things. And then I think the biggest thing, which again, we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, I think later on in your questions, was just getting back. I was just so wrecked. I was so much more tired than I expected. And I tried to do one workout, I think on Friday, and it just like did not go super well. This was like an expectations versus reality thing being way off. And so yeah, I think it was an opportunity for me to practice being really kind to myself and patient, and just giving my body the space that it needs to get back into the swing of things. And I think today was really the day that I started to feel really more like myself, which was exciting. So like I said, I'm very glad we're having this today and not like on Friday afternoon.
Good to hear. Okay. So the first thing I read in your training log was you started with this enormous 3-hour treadmill session at some crazy incline. How do you stop from going bananas, to use a technical term, or just get? I mean, that's 3 hours is a long time to just be on a treadmill, walking or running uphill. So, what do you do to try and cope with those sessions?
It's interesting because I actually think if you're doing something that's harder and more structured, it's easier to do something that long. If you're doing an interval workout, or if you're even doing just something that has more variation, these days were literally just like easy, like zone one, zone two days. And for me, those are the hardest things to do in the gym, whether it's on the treadmill or the bike or whatever, because your mind is not really that engaged in what you're doing because it's pretty easy, right? And so it's not trivial. I mean, honestly, like both of these days, I was getting up in the morning before it was even light out, and it just wasn't really an option to go outside. And I wanted to get uphill training. We've talked about lots of times, uphill training is what it's all about. So, this is one of those things where it's not all glamorous, and it's just sometimes, you go to your job and it's awesome. And sometimes you go to your job and it's kind of tedious. And again, I'm still super grateful that my job is I get paid to exercise, and that like could not be more grateful for that. But at the same time, yeah, those days are challenging, I would say. I think I try to mix up different stimuli. So I'll start off with something that's like less engaging of my brain. So maybe I won't do anything and just stare at the thing for a bit and kind of let my mind settle. Maybe I'll listen to something but not watch something. And then as it gets longer and I get more kind of mentally and physically fatigued, I'll actually do things that are more stimulating. So I'll watch a TV show or watch a movie. And in this case, it's like, even I will stagger it. So it's like, oh, if there's like a TV show that I'm really into right now, which right now I'm watching Severance, which is wild. I don't know if you guys have watched that. But
No.
it's incredibly engaging. And so I literally will be like, oh, there's like a 45-minute episode of Severance. So I'm going to save that till I get through to like 2 hours. So you can like kind of play little games with your mind where you like give yourself points to look forward to and stuff. But at the end of the day, it's just like, it's not hard. It's just, you just have to do it. It's not, there's no point in that where it's like, oh no, I don't know if I can physically do it. It's just like, well, it just gets kind of old after a while and you just have to keep doing it. And that's kind of how it goes.
Yep. Yep. Okay. Okay. What is Severance about?
Severance is this really interesting kind of dystopian sci-fi. It's not quite sci-fi, but it's like a sci-fi premise, but then it's really just like a character drama.
Uh-huh.
And the idea is effectively that there's this company. It's kind of like near future, so it's not like super futuristic. It's like modern day, but the idea is there's this procedure that these people can do where they sever their brains into two halves. And so they work in this place where they're doing this super top secret work. And in there, their brain is like a different brain than the outside world brain. So they have like an entire personality and human being that's in this building that's like tied to that side of the brain. And then when they leave, it's like a different person and they have no idea what they do for work. So they have like the same personality kind of, but they have no memories, right? So they have no memories of what they're doing in there when they're outside, and then their inside person has no memories of what they if they have a family or where they're from or anything. They just wake up in this place and then they're, orientated and stuff. And it's obviously very spooky and, you don't know what they're
Yeah.
doing. And like, it's really interesting. It's really, really well made.
Okay. All right. Does sound interesting. Maybe we'll check it out.
Yeah.
Okay. So, back to the workouts. Tuesday, you
Yep.
talked about feeling a little bit ill, and you noted that this was not common. This was unusual for you. So,
Yeah.
how do you tell the difference between just normal fatigue and something more concerning?
Partly it's just experience and knowing my body super well. This was a case where I was like, I kind of feel like I'm going to throw up, and I think it's just jet lag, honestly. It was just, that is one of the things that I feel, whether it's east west travel and jet lag, or literally just like getting up at really odd hours, like super early in the morning. Sometimes I feel really sick to my stomach, and that was what I was feeling that day. And so for me, it's really just, yeah, knowing that this is something that I've experienced before. It happens usually in situations like this where I'm up early or I'm just like way off my sleep schedule, especially if I'm exercising like outside of my circadian rhythms, which I was. And yeah, it honestly, it just comes back to experience. So at the end of the day, it is a hard line sometimes between what is acceptable tiredness, fatigue, and what is like breakdown or overtraining. That's a much finer line. And I felt like I was struggling a little bit with that in the second half of the week. But this day it was just like, oh God, I feel like I'm gonna barf. And like, so which is like, I don't usually have that. I'm like, oh, it's probably because it's 4:30 in the morning and I don't even know what time that is. We're like at my house, but like, I'm trying to do a workout right now and it's really not feeling good.
Yeah. Okay. You did mention that you were super cranky on Thursday, which was your
Mm.
first day back from your trip in Quito, and you were back in Quito. So how does how does your overall mood and mental state impact your training decisions?
Um, how does it impact my training decisions? I think I try to like let go of that stuff while like acknowledging that it's there. So being like, okay, like I can tell when I'm in a bad mood very quick. I'm like, oh, I'm like every little thing is bothering me. It's where it shouldn't. And sometimes it's going back to, we've talked about mindfulness and mindset and just like taking a deep breath and resetting and like all these things. In terms of affecting training, I try to separate those things, while at the same time recognizing that, okay, like if I'm cranky, it's usually a symptom of something else, right? And if it's in a race, it usually means I'm hungry or I'm under caffeinated. And if it's just in general, then it's usually I'm overtired. That's almost always what it is. I'm either I'm overtired or I'm stressed because I've like overcommitted and I'm feeling rushed and stuff like that. So those are usually the things that make me feel cranky. So in this case, it was obviously just I'm super overtired. That was the day I got back after a 24-hour day getting back from Europe. And I was just it was like that thing, like every little thing was bothering me. And like I feel like I'm not usually like that. I think I'm usually a pretty go with the flow kind of person. And so I could tell like, oh, this is probably going to manifest in other ways. Like, my run is probably not going to be fantastic today, and that's fine. And so I guess it dials back the expectations, which is important. And I definitely could have carried that more into Friday. But I think it's mostly just a signal of like, okay, you need to give yourself a lot of grace today and just be kind to yourself and recognize that not everything is going to go perfectly, whether that's in life or training or whatever. And just don't take it all to heart. Like it's going to be fine. You just need a good night's sleep and everything will feel a lot better.
Okay. Okay. So in terms of particulars, the bike calibration really seemed to get under your skin. So and I can understand that because, all of us who experience the vast amounts of technology now in our lives have these frustrations with things that, you have to troubleshoot them one way or another. So how do you in your particular case, since these are very specific mechanisms for your training, how do you troubleshoot equipment problems while not letting it sort of destroy your training momentum?
I will say off the bat, I am not a bicycle person. And like it kind I guess this is a little bit of funny side note, but when I came down here right after I got Achilles surgery, and I was setting up my bike setup, I remember calling Connor, because Connor, who we are surprised having as our special guest later on this episode, and who was here with me in Quito last week. Connor is really good with bicycles, relative to your average bear. And so he's the person I call when I have bike issues. And so I remember when I first got here that December, like 2 Decembers ago, and was setting up the bike, and it was like I was having so much trouble with it. It was so frustrating. I was like calling him, like voice calling him like every day, like, dude, what am I doing wrong? Like, why can't I get this thing to work? And like once I got it, it was fine. It worked great. But it was like the first like few days, it just felt like every day, like the tube was breaking, or like the machine wasn't calibrated well, or like I don't know what it was, but I'm bad at bicycles is the long story short. So here I have, my lovely bike setup on our balcony here. And I came back and I'm like, oh man, like it seemed like the machine is not working quite well. It was like making a weird noise. I was like, oh no, this is not good. And again, it was just like one of these things that like objectively is like not that big a deal. Like we figured it out in like half an hour, but at the time, and like I'm sure in my log I made it very dramatic because it just felt like another one of those things, right? And it's like this trip like very much pulled me way out of this routine that I had that was so like, my routine was so good. It was so dialed and I felt so good in training. And then I come home and it's like nothing is working. My bike's not working. Like finally, and I'm just like this like angry, like, you know, entitled brat, basically like toddler, like slamming my fist on the table, like, why doesn't anything work? And you know, it is what it is. Like equipment is equipment. Like we use a lot of different stuff, whether it's, your GPS watch, your Garmin, or your stationary bike, the gym, like all these things. And,
Right.
again, at the end of the day, it's just a matter of perspective. Like to me, that's the thing that I always come back to is like when I'm having a temper tantrum about this stuff, it's like, okay, just like let's take a step back and zoom out. You are angry because your personal stationary bike set up on your beautiful balcony looking over the forest isn't working perfectly. Like that's not that big a deal. And it speaks to a greater issue, which is that like this is a really sweet setup and like sometimes things will break and it's fine and don't freak out about it. So yeah, it can be really frustrating in the moment, but it's really just like, okay, like that's fine. Let's get it figured out. And we did, and now it's working again. So it's okay.
Okay. It's all about perspective.
Yep.
Okay.
100%.
Okay. So let's talk about Friday. You had planned a triple Polachowski session with Fartlex, as I recall, and
Yep.
it didn't go that well. So walk us through what happened and how you decided to cut it short.
I basically just got overconfident. I had, this was so again, Wednesday night I get back super late after very very long day of travel. Thursday I'm all cranky and annoyed and have a terrible training session, but it's whatever, it's fine. It's just like a recovery day. And then I get one really good night's sleep, and I'd planned, kind of a medium light session on Friday, and I was like, oh, I feel fine, let's go for it. And it was really just an expectations versus reality thing. I thought I was way more recovered than I was, and so I planned a more aggressive session, which yeah, was the idea was to basically do laps, so like do 3 laps up and down Polichaski, which is about 3,000 meters of climbing, which I figured would be a good kind of medium long run with some light fart like in there. And I wrote in my log afterwards. It's like there were like some little things. It was really hot that day. I was like really like I don't usually sweat a ton, but I was like soaking wet with sweat. It was really sunny and hot. I was carrying more weight because I had a bigger pack for this, longer workout than I usually do. But at the end of the day, I was just overtired still. I just wasn't quite recovered from the travel and the whole week. And um, you know, again, I can tell in my mindset when it's time to push and when it's not. And this was one of those where I just, halfway up that second rep, I was like, this is just not feeling productive. I'm not hitting the paces that I want. I'm not hitting the energy systems that I want. And again, it goes all the way back. This was don't get greedy. Like there's no reason to push right now. Like what this is telling me is not that you're not fit enough. It's that you're not recovered enough. And that's a really important distinction. Again, I'll bring John Waldron back into this. He talks a lot about this idea of you can be really, really fit, but if you are overtrained, not recovered or injured, your body like doesn't have access to that fitness. And that's how that day felt. It felt like I didn't have access to that fitness. And the answer there is not to push harder. It's exactly the opposite. It's to dial back and let your body recover, because your fitness doesn't go away. It doesn't just disappear in like 5 days, right? So we all know that objectively. It can be hard in the moment emotionally, but the truth is, yeah, your fitness doesn't disappear in a week. So it was like a little bit of a pity party there at the end, but it was like, okay, this is fine. I clearly just need a couple more good nights sleep. And again, that was Friday. Now it's Sunday. We're feeling great. Today was a really good day. And I think next week is going to be a good one.
That's really interesting, and resonates with me even in mental efforts, because, I've been a technology person and a programmer my whole life off and on. And one of the things I learned programming early on is, because programming is a total rabbit hole. You can, I used to joke, just one more bug, honey, I'll be right there. And 3 hours later, you're still working. And
Yep.
on the same bug sometimes. And what I learned, and one of the things I think that made me a good programmer, was if I spent more than 15 or 20 minutes on it, the best thing I could do was, as you said, not to work harder, but in fact to walk away, to take it
Yep.
easier, and to really separate yourself from that moment. Because in the terms you were using, you have a certain amount of debugging and mental capacity to do these complex tasks. And at some point, you get fatigued to the point where you don't have access to that system. Or it could be that that day, as you said, you just didn't get a good night's sleep the night before, you were traveling or whatever. You just don't have access to that same capacity that you normally have. It's not that it's not there, you just don't have it. And it's remarkable. And I hear authors talk about this all the time
Yeah.
too. I'm blocked. I'm stuck with a character. And the really successful authors that you hear interviewed often will say, that's when I walk away.
Yep.
Though it's not exactly the same, but it's analogous, I think, in the sense that they've lost that access to that writing capacity and that problem solving capacity, because something's off, right? They're either too fatigued from the effort they're currently under, or they're not recovered in the sense that they had a bad night's sleep or whatever. So it's interesting. It's interesting. I like that. I'm going to keep that in mind the next time I'm stuck somewhere.
Yeah, we talk in sport a lot about being in a hole. The idea with training, right, is you train every day, and so like your fatigue will go up, your readiness to perform will go down after you train. And the idea is that then you recover and you get a little bit better, right? And so it should be like kind of a sawtooth, but it's going up. But sometimes if you're training too hard and you don't give yourself enough room to recover, you end up with a negative sawtooth, and then you're in a hole. You're net negative. And it's not necessarily that you're not fit, it's that you're training harder than you're able to recover. And that's where you get into trouble. And if you do that for too long, that's what we call overtraining. And so I think that is a really good analogy. It works. I have the same exact thing, whether I'm working on writing or something for work, coaching project, whatever it is. Sometimes you're like, I need to step away from this. And then you come back the next day or whatever, and it's like, oh, it's fresh, it's clear. You've let yourself recover. You're coming at it with rest. And, that is the best medicine sometimes, is just literally a good night's sleep, and some space from the thing. So yeah, it's 100% it's exactly the same idea, I think.
Okay, great. And a little more on this. So we've covered some of this, but let's talk a little bit more about it. You wrote what I thought was quite an insightful postmortem after your Friday session. So what is it that makes you able to look objectively at things, even when they're not going that well, whether they're going well or whether they're not going well, and sort of get that little bit of remove so you can make a good postmortem and try and learn as much as possible?
We talked at some point about failure, and I think in one of the bonus sections, cooldown sections. And again, I'll go back to the idea that to me the only failure is something where I don't learn something. And so the quicker I can go from being upset about something not going great to what can I take away from this, to me that's a huge win. And so this was literally like I was writing this with my thumbs on the cable car down after this workout. I was like, okay, that didn't go super well. What can I take away from this? And to me, it's helpful because it's important to feel those feelings. It's important to be upset if it's something really important. This wasn't something very important. So that was like very quickly, let's get over this and let's figure out very quickly from a pragmatic sense what to do about this, because this was like literally a day-to-day thing. I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do tomorrow in training. Like, should I take a 0 day? Should I like totally change my macro cycles and put a little recovery block here? And so I think to answer your question of how I do it, it's almost out of necessity, because it's literally how I'm scheduling my time, and if I don't do that, then like I'm literally going to wake up the next morning and not know what to do. And I think that everything I do in training is incredibly intentional. And if I don't have that intention, I don't have a plan, you're, I think that's part of why I've been somewhat successful, So that particular postmortem, we talked about a lot of the stuff already, but in a way, I think it was actually almost like a really helpful dress rehearsal, this trip to Europe, for when I relocate from here to Nepal. Like, that's one of the things I've taken away from it, is
Right.
looking at it as, that's another thing that's coming up. I'm going to Nepal on April 1st or something, and that's also an extremely long trip. It's going to be really disruptive to my training. It's going to involve a lot of flights, a lot of sleeping in weird places at weird times. Then you're going to have 15 hours of jet lag or whatever it is. So it almost felt like, oh, wow, this was like the silver lining of this. And maybe this is like the optimist of me, but it's like, oh, the silver lining in this is like, this was kind of a practice session of what that's going to feel like. And that to me is the biggest takeaway, is looking at it as, okay, I know, like, I should plan for feeling like complete shit for like 3 or 4 days when I get to Nepal. And that is 100% fine.
Right.
And it goes back to all this stuff about building fitness and getting ready and being like almost more ready than you need to be, so that, that 80% level is fine. You don't need to be at 100% immediately when you get there. It's like, okay, if I have a week when I get to Nepal and I'm just like kind of futzing around and getting into the swing of things and like just very, very low bar expectations, that's totally fine. And then if it's anything better than that, great. That's fantastic. That's an A+, right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah. Good words of advice that I could use more of myself, because I'm I'm not great at conducting good postmortems when I get frustrated at something. And I think a lot of us tend to rationalize rather than analyze, is the way I would put it. And so you're trying to create a narrative or a story to yourself about, how it wasn't your fault, or you're just trying to make it go away and put it in a little cocoon and then just forget about it, as opposed to opening that little ugly thing up and saying, well, what actually happened here and what can I learn from it? So
Well,
good
I think
advice.
the story and the narrative can be helpful, but I think it's the that idea of avoiding responsibility that you're talking about that's not helpful. Because to me, I've done this enough times over, almost 20 years, that I know that avoiding responsibility is not going to help me do better next time. You know, if I say, oh, it's not my fault. It was that, I had to wait in line in customs for an extra 2 hours, and it was really hot on Friday. Those were the problems. They weren't me. I could have done all this stuff if it just weren't for those things. Like, well, guess what? Like, first of all, things like that will probably happen next time, because that's just how life is, right? Like, there's always going to be weird little annoying things like that. But also, just those are outside of our control. There's still so many things that are inside of our control that we can that can have an impact on the outcome. The most important of which is our attitude and how we approach it. And I think that's the biggest thing for me looking at this from a postmortem perspective, is what is my attitude when I land in Kathmandu? My attitude is I expect to feel like complete dog shit, and that's fine. That's totally fine. And building my schedule for April around the fact that, the first week of April is basically going to be a wash, and that's okay. And I'm 100% fine with that. And anything better than dog shit is like a huge success.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting. And again, another good thing to keep in mind, because one thing you do have control over is your attitude. So you can't
Yep.
control a lot of the events that are happening to you, but you can control your attitude towards them. So that's important.
Yep.
Great. Dads can learn from sons. Isn't
Hey,
it great?
that's my hope is, we're learning from each other. I think it's great.
Yeah. Okay. So one thing I noticed is you added a new thing into your cross training called posture exercises. So what are posture exercises and what prompted you to add them into your cross training?
I had a conversation with Connor when we were driving to the airport last week when he was leaving, and we were talking about training and this idea that we talked about in the last episode of can you be too fit too early? And one of the things that he said that really struck me was, you're so fit right now, you should be focusing any extra time you have on making your body more resilient, not necessarily making yourself fitter, but just making yourself stronger and like less prone to get hurt, because that's really going to be the only way that this doesn't go well is if you get hurt. So what can you do? Like anything that you can do about that. And he called me out. He was like, yeah, I was filming you. I had a social media post he was filming me from the truck. The last minute or two running in the Cotopaxi thing. He's like, yeah, your back could be straight. You have kind of bad posture. And I'm like, yeah, I fucking know. Like, I think I've had bad posture forever. I'll blame you for that.
I
but,
told you it's charged.
but no,
I'm
it's
still
a real
working
thing
on
that
it.
I've seen videos of myself running, especially when I get tired. I really hunch forward, and that is something like that is not the ideal running mechanics to have. And so yeah, it's something like I literally while I was in Europe, I just asked Dr. Claude. Shout out to Anthropic. Um, I asked Dr. Claude, "Hey, I'm a pro runner. I would love to improve my posture. Here's a video of me running. What do you think I should do?" And he, Dr. Claude gave me like a 8 week thing with some exercises. They're super basic. But yeah, that's it. It's like 10 minutes a day kind of thing. It's not really like strength. It's mostly like postural, like some very light band kind of stuff and like standing against a wall, things like that. Some light back and abdominal stuff. But yeah, it's one of these ideas of okay, where if I have more time in my week, how can I allocate that to make my body more resilient? That's really the idea there.
Great. Excellent. Okay. And taking advantage of the new tools to help you.
Yeah,
Okay.
gotta love Dr. Claude.
Okay. On Saturday, you mentioned that you were using your machete to do trail maintenance while running.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that. What makes you do that? Are you giving back to the community? Are you venting frustration? More things?
um, Good question. It's a little bit of all those things. I actually hadn't thought about the venting frustration. No, it's definitely not that. It's really hard work. I would say part of it is it's a trail that I love, and selfishly, it gets really overgrown. And there was a really big storm while I was away, and so like a bunch of stuff got blown down. And so it's literally just hard to go through certain places, and I shopping, trying to make the trail clearer for me. And there are other people that use that trail, especially on weekends. I see other runners. So yeah, hopefully that's helpful to everybody. There's another like kind of interesting thing with that is it forces me to go really slow. Obviously you're chopping, but I usually go up Polychowski in like an hour 20 or something, and it took me 2+ hours or something, and my heart rate is way lower. So it allows me to, it's literally like a control mechanism for me to force myself to slow down
Yep.
sometimes, where
Yep.
it's like, okay, like this is a way to like make myself chill out and also do something that's hopefully productive for me and the community. So yeah, I
Yeah.
guess it's a little bit of all of that.
Great. Yeah. So that's a classic distraction factor, to make you go slower without having to tell yourself to go slower. Just force yourself
Yeah.
to do something like that. Interesting. Okay, great. Sunday, you said you finally felt better. You were
Yeah.
feeling normal, I think actually was what you said. So how do you tell? What are the indicators you look for that tell you that you're normal, that you're back on track?
Yeah, it's mostly, I mean, we've talked about all these different metrics before, but because I'm so familiar with these trails and I'm so in tune with my body's effort and, biostats, which is mostly heart rate in this case, I can tell really quickly, that first day, Thursday, and even Friday when I had that bad workout, I could just tell that everything was off. It was like the heart rate was too high, the effort was too high for the pace. Like all this stuff was just way, way off. And I was like, oh man, like did I just lose all my fitness in 5 days or what? And, obviously that's not true, but it's easy to think that in the moment sometimes. And today it was just, I think I wrote in my log, it was a perfectly fine day. There was nothing exceptional about it, but it was just totally normal. It was like, if I time warped back to before this trip, it was like that would be a totally normal, like easy, normal, moderate day. And that was exactly what I wanted. It was like, okay, I'm up Polichowski in 73 minutes. My heart rate's 125. That's exactly what I want. I'm at the summit in 212, whatever it is. Like, I know all these splits like by heart at this point, and I know exactly what each heart rate means. And so just to have, especially after having it be so far off for a couple of days, seeing it come back down after, like we talked about, a few really good nights sleep and just recovering and eating well and being in home and not being jet lagged, that was just okay, like this huge sigh of relief of, okay, like, whew, it's okay. It's gonna be okay. It's not me. It's just like my body was super fatigued, and now everything's gonna be fine. Like, it was just like this huge sigh of relief, and it was a
Okay,
great day. It was a beautiful day. Yeah.
good. So it's sort of a combination of things of heart rate and time and effort and just general feeling.
Yeah, I'd really say like the two things that I keep track of are like the time for these various segments. So like the Polichowski is one, and then like two, the summit is another. So like what's my time on that, and then what's my heart rate for that time. And so I
Uh-huh.
know like when I'm going on a normal easy day, like if I'm over 80 minutes, I'm really tired, and if I'm under 75 minutes, like that's pretty good. And then if my heart rate, assuming my heart rate is in like the 120s, like that's kind of how I look at it. So
Okay.
it is pretty finely dialed. And I know exactly what all that means, and it's just, yeah, it's really nice. And being able to just like go up there and be up there on a beautiful day, it was great.
Great. Okay. So, looking at the full week, some of which we can't even talk about, but it was an exciting week overall. In some ways good, in some ways not so good. A disruptive week, maybe, is the way to put it as well. What lessons will you take from it so you can apply these to future training blocks after you have these travel disruptions? I mean, you said a little bit already about
Yeah.
going to the fall. Is there anything you would add?
Yeah, I feel like we talked about this before, and I think we did a good job. I mean, again, the summary I would say is just lower expectations. That's the big takeaway for me. Um, Whenever you have a really big trip, I was actually just talking to one of my athletes about this. She had a death in her family and had to make a really long trip very suddenly. And I was like, look, this was on like Thursday or Friday, like right after I got back to keto. I was like, I basically, I obviously didn't have a death in my family, but I had a really long, stressful trip. And I felt like I ran a 100-mile race the day I got back. Like, that's how exhausted I was. So just like give yourself as much grace as possible. Just expect to feel terrible. Be kind to yourself. Do all the nice things. Like, have all the food, like good, tasty foods you want. Like, get cozy in your bed. Like, whatever it is, like, be really nice to yourself and just recognize your fitness does not disappear in a few days. You might not necessarily have access to it at this moment, but it will come back, and it will come back quicker than you think. It'll come back in a few days if you can get really, really good sleep and nutrition and bring the stress down a little bit. So that's kind of what I would say to other people, and what I am trying to remind myself, because again, I'm going to do this again in like 4 weeks, going to Nepal. So I think again, it's been helpful. That's the silver lining. It's the optimist in me, and I'm excited to like now just be feeling good, feeling like myself, and looking forward to the
Yeah.
last we got 4 weeks here until
Yeah.
until we head out.
Well, again, and I think another thing that you've expressed here that I think is important and can help all of us is you're feeling better because you were able to learn. And
Exactly.
so what you're grading yourself on, okay, is did I learn as opposed to did I make this particular mark on this particular day? And that's
Yep.
that's an attitudinal thing, which we also talked about. So, and it helps you get your mind into a better place, and that helps you perform better, gets the interferences out of the way. So that's great. Great session. That's all I had to on my list of questions. Anything you want to add?
No, I'm very glad we're doing this today, like I said, and not a couple days
Yes,
ago.
right.
And I
Because you had
am,
a good day, right?
yeah, I'm very excited now to be feeling like myself, and again, not get greedy, but looking forward to a good last 4 weeks here in Quito.
Okay, so for today's cool down, we have an interesting topic and a special guest. So the topic is going to be about high altitude acclimatization, and the special guest is Conor. So Conor, why don't you give your brief intro and then we'll get started.
Hey, yeah, excited to be recording with y'all. I'm Connor. I live in the Boston area. I'm a distance runner, mostly marathons, but all kinds of stuff. I met Ty. Well, I first started working with Ty as a coach back in 2020, I think. And then we became really good friends, and we've gone on lots of adventures together, mostly to high altitude locations to do silly things high up in the mountains. So, yeah, very
Yep.
appropriate.
So a good person to join us to talk about high altitude acclimatization. Thanks for joining.
Definitely. And I will just say for our listeners, if you've been listening week by week, Connor, we talked about Connor last week because he was actually here in Quito with me for about a week, and we climbed Cotopaxi together and stuff. And Connor's also one of my best friends, so he skipped that part. So that's why he's here. He's
Okay.
He's an incredible resource, and he's hilarious and my best friend, and we have a lot of awesome dumb adventures, and I can't wait to nerd out about altitude together.
Let's
Great.
do it.
All right. So, Connor, you've been up in the mountains with Tyler. Can you share your perspective on how each of you approach altitude differently and how this might differ from the conventional wisdom about altitude and acclimatization?
Sure. So I can really only speak for myself. My experience with Tyler and altitude is he's pretty much always more or less acclimatized, and it has very little impact on what he does. Now, I haven't gone to the Himalaya with him. I haven't gone up to above 7,000 meters with him, so I'm sure it's a different story there. But for the stuff that we've done in South America and the Andes, I tend to meet up with him somewhere, and he's been there for a bit, so he's already good to go. My first trip to altitude was to Ecuador on a Chasqui trip with Ty, and my experience with that was that a lot of people on the trip, or some people on the trip, were had headaches and were feeling kind of crappy and were struggling with some activities, and I felt totally fine. And Ty would say, "Wow, I can't believe like how well you're doing on this," and I'd say, "I don't know, I'm just doing it. I don't have any any waypoints or any points of reference for like should this be harder? Should I feel worse?" I'm familiar with all the risks of acute mountain sickness and HAPE and HACE, so I've always tried to be somewhat cautious. But as we continue to do more things, I think that the extreme example was in I think 20. When did we go to Tanzania? Was that 2022?
Early 2023, it would have been.
Right. So
About 2 years ago.
Ty sent me a message. Hey, do you want to go to Kilimanjaro next week? And I said, okay, sure, why not? And ended up going from sea level to the Barafu camp, which is about was it 4,700 meters, I think, or 4,300 meters. It's pretty high. 47 in under 48 hours, and then went to the summit of Kilimanjaro. I think about 36 hours after that. We took a rest day in between, but it was basically
Thank goodness
2 days to Barafu, a rest day, summit, which is dramatically more aggressive than anybody would ever recommend doing. The sort of I talked to a friend of mine who's a doctor, and she said she gave me a sort of list of like risk factors for HAPE and HACE and AMS, and the canonical example was ascending Kilimanjaro in less than 7 days puts you at significant risk for us. So
whoops.
we did that in less than half, and this is a theme with doing things with Tyler that goes beyond just altitude acclimatization. But we have a lot of fun. We mess around, but at the end of the day, he really knows what he's doing and is very experienced in those mountains, and I trust him completely. And when he says, "I've seen what you've done before, you'll be fine," I can, more or less rely on that. Now, I'm always, touching wood when I say this. It could my luck could run out. But so my experience with going to altitude has been that, like, wow, I feel like I'm very lucky in that I really don't have to worry about this very much. Now, sure, it feels harder, but I never feel sick. I've never had any health issues with doing that.
Okay, so as the jargon police, can you explain what? Yeah, I think you used 3 terms: HAPE and HAFE and AM something or other.
Yeah. So AMS is acute mountain sickness. That's basically your sort of headache, malaise, not sleeping well.
Nausea.
It's
Yeah.
you're not gonna it's not a life-threatening condition. It's just feeling crappy from going to altitude from sea level. HAPE stands for high altitude pulmonary edema.
That sounds serious.
It is extremely serious. It's a life-threatening condition. It's a medical emergency. People die from HAPE. This is when your lungs fill with fluid and you need to descend as quickly as possible. And HACE stands for high altitude cerebral edema, and that is a fluid buildup in your brain. And that is also a medical emergency and life-threatening potentially if you cannot descend.
Yep. And HACE, which you also mentioned, is high altitude flatulence excretion, which is a real thing. You can look that up. It's basically the idea that you fart a lot more at altitude because there's all these pressure changes inside your body. It's true. You got to equalize that pressure, man. You got to let those farts out.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
HACE,
a real thing. The HACE is real.
The HACE is very, we have very strong supporting evidence
either
of that.
Keep your distance or pack one of those air freshener things along in your backpack.
Yep. Something like that. And the other, I want to just jump in before we go to the next question, because I think Conor said a lot of important things. And the big caveat is that, you know, when I am with anyone, whether it's a friend or a big group of people with Chosky, like a big part of my job is looking at how people are responding and looking for those AMS symptoms or those HAPE symptoms, or even just something as simple as how out of breath is this person walking up the stairs in the morning on the way to breakfast or something, you know? And one of the things I saw with Conor, I remember that very first trip. That was literally the first time you and I ever hung out in person, I think. And it was like the second day or third day, and we went up Ruku together on the Telferico and like ran up in the rain. And like everybody else just kind of like walked around a little bit. And you and I like ran all the way to the bear cave or something, which is like 4,400 meters. And I was like, whoa, I guess this guy's like totally fine. And that's cool. So it's like the thing that I found is like usually past performance is a indicator of future performance. So if you've had experiences where you've gone to altitude before, and you felt fine, you know, it's not a golden ticket, but it's usually, if you're going to have a lot of problems, you're going to have them immediately. So like I know people who have gotten HAPE and HACE at like 10,000 feet in Colorado, and that's super, super rare, but that happened like the first time they went up. So if you're going to have a problem like that, it often manifests really early. And if you are not going to have a problem like that and you feel fine, like that's generally more of a, you know, yellow light, proceed with caution kind of thing. But, you know, all of this stuff is with the caveat that like there's a lot of like do as I say, not as I do. And like you should really, if you're going to altitude and you're listening to this, like you should be with someone who knows what they're doing and who's been to altitude before and who can keep an eye on you for a safety side. Because like HAPE and HACE are super, super serious. People do die every year, whether it's in Colorado or it's in the Himalaya, super serious conditions. So, you know, what Conor and I do and like going to Kilimanjaro in 3 days is like totally outrageous, but like, you know, it is a really serious thing. And like people do get killed up there from this. So we should like put that caveat at the very beginning here.
Okay.
Very good point.
And just to calibrate it for mere normal mortals, I think the first time that my wife and I visited you, Tyler, your mother and I visited you in Quito, maybe the second day you took us up the cable car, which is not even all the way up, right?
No, it's like 4,000 meters.
Yeah. And we got off of that cable car and literally had to sit down and get almost down on our knees. So we didn't have altitude sickness in that sense. We didn't. At least I didn't have a headache or anything. I just couldn't breathe. Just literally couldn't breathe. And so for most people, the altitudes you guys are talking about are really, really difficult. They're not trivial at all. And so it's unusual. And yes, you do have to be cautious going up to any of these altitudes, even lower altitudes like where we were. You will feel it. You get used to it. You do get used to it. We get used to it, but it's not easy, especially when you first walk out. For most normal people. And speaking of which, so do you think that you two are special?
Obviously.
How do you adapt? or do you? Or I'm seriously though, do you think there's something about your physiologies or something, or do you think that the conventional wisdom is just wrong?
I think it's probably a little bit from column A, a little bit from column B.
Yeah. Porque no
I
los
mean,
dos.
with me and Tyler, I mean, we're talking about an experiment of two right here,
Yep.
and we know for a fact that Tyler is a world-class athlete. There are very few, if any, people who can perform better than him at very high altitude. And then there's me, and so we have pretty limited data. I think that, and this is where we can go into maybe a little bit more of a deep dive and a little bit of science here. I have a hypothesis that a high level of cardiovascular fitness can be protective against mountain sickness. Now, the literature and many articles which will cite the literature will say that fitness has no protective effect against AMS, HAPE, and HACE. And so I thought that was interesting. I said, well, I'd like to go and look at these studies. And so I found a few studies, and most of them seem to reference back to one study in particular. And so I found a PDF and I read the study. And what this study did was take a group of people, I think it was about 25 or 26 participants, and they measured their VO2 max at sea level. VO2 max is the maximum amount of oxygen that your muscles and your body can consume. It's a pretty kind of the gold standard for cardiovascular and aerobic fitness. They do this test on a treadmill. And then they brought them up to altitude, and I believe in Bolivia, and they observed them and they scored them. So sort of 4 categories, 0 to 3 score, basically to assess their degree of acute mountain sickness. And the study found that there was no correlation between VO2 max and AMS symptoms. But I looked at this study, and there was 2 people who had a VO2 max over 60. One person had a VO2 max of about 63. One person had a VO2 max of about 76. Everybody else is below there.
Those are very high numbers for context. Those are like those you could be an elite marathoner with those numbers.
Right. So there's very limited data in terms of, and so I just to say those 2 people had pretty low scores for AMS, not 0, but you look at the criteria, there's things like insomnia, low appetite. If I were to score myself on one of these things, I wouldn't score a 0 because sometimes I don't sleep as well at altitude. I don't tend to have as much of an appetite at altitude. So they were sort of in line with what I would experience, I think. So it's hard for me to look at those data and say there is no effect, there's no protective effect of cardiovascular fitness on this, because you're only examining a small portion of people who are, extremely physically fit. I've never had VO2 max testing done, but, my race performances would probably put me somewhere in the mid 60s. So now, how well does this generalize to other people? If very, very few people have a VO2 max that high, well, what good is it to say, well, if you're really, really fit, you may not have as many of these symptoms? But I think I would like to do more research. I'm not a scientist, but I think it'd be really interesting to repeat that study with very, very highly trained athletes, or even just people who, do a lot of aerobic training. Sometimes these articles will talk about people who are, very physically fit because they're running 25 or 30 miles a week, which sure is a lot of miles compared to how much most people run. But, lots of people run 70, 80, 100 miles a week, even sort of amateur runners. So
yeah,
I think it's I
mean,
think more research is needed.
The thing that jumps out to me about that is that there's only 23 people in the study. That's such a small group. It's so I've worked personally with well over 100 people. I mean, I led high school trips and college trips. I probably had 20 or 30 people every single year. Many of whom were coming to altitude for the first time and were runners of varying degrees, from super beginner to, elite college runners. And so I saw this every single summer with 30 people for 10 years. I probably saw a couple hundred people worth of data. And I personally saw this correlation very strongly of, every summer at orientation, I would lie to everybody and say, there's no correlation. Don't worry. Cause you don't want people to feel bad and be like, oh, I'm less fit and therefore I'm going to suffer more. And then it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. But like 100%, like I think I saw a correlation between how well people adapted and how quickly they adapted, and their overall fitness. And I think you could see that, anywhere from, super beginner runner to very competitive runner. You could talk about VO2 max range of that's probably like 30 to 70 or something. It's a huge range. So I don't think you necessarily even need to look specifically at, just super elite runners. I think you could look at that whole spectrum, of weekend warrior to professional athlete. And I think you're going to see a pretty strong correlation there. Now, again, even a couple hundred people, I'm not doing actual science. Like, this is all super anecdotal, but like my general experience is the fitter you are, the easier it is. And like, I do think that bucks the conventional wisdom. And I think that, to me, the biggest thing as someone who brings people to altitude and is in charge of their safety and their, overall experience, I think the biggest thing with the conventional wisdom that I disagree with and push a little bit is, I think that, that idea, Conor, that you mentioned about risking HAPE is going up Kilimanjaro in less than a week. I think that almost all altitude protocols for going up high are based on the lowest common denominator. And so those things are usually really successful because they're catering to the person who is going to struggle. And so every single other person is going to be fine. And like, guess what? Like 90% of those people probably could be fine on a schedule that's 3 times more aggressive than that. But they're never going to do that because the guide is saying, okay, I have a big group and I'm going to cater to the lowest common denominator, where I feel like, okay, I'm going to cater more to the median and say, I think that most people can do this. I don't think everybody's going to be Conor and they're going to go up Kilimanjaro in 2 days or something. But I think that most people can maybe do a little bit more than a conventional wisdom. So I think that's kind of where I would disagree and where I push back. And again, I still try to be more conservative than I would if it were like just you and me, Conor. Like when we do the Atacama trip, for example, like that's a way more gentle schedule than if it were just the two of us. And that's even you coming from sea level. But it's still way more aggressive than like any other program out there if you look at other trips to that area,
Yeah. I think the other thing that is related to athleticism and training at altitude, especially if you're going to go up high and do something difficult, do something athletic, is just having a training to say, I can feel really, really bad and it's going to be fine. And because like this is
Yep.
something that I mean, I experience. Like I'm not gonna sit here and say that like, oh, I can go up to like 4,000 meters and like, run 5K at the same speed that I'm going to. Like, no, of course it like affects my performance, and working really hard, very high, feels incredibly bad. But I have done a lot of training. I have felt incredibly bad in training, and I've done enough of it at altitude that I just sort of know that it's like you move the sort of bar of how bad you can feel for a certain amount of time. Like if I did a VK, vertical kilometer, with Tyler in Peru, and I think I did it for about an hour. I think that was around my time roughly, and the sort of perceived effort level was something that I could sustain at sea level for, gosh, maybe 20 minutes, but I don't know. It like for a much shorter amount of time. And so you just have these, you need to adjust your mindset about how something is going to feel. And I think that athletes are more flexible in doing that. You can just say like, oh, well, that's like, that feels really bad, but apparently I can do it for a really long time, and as soon as I stop, it feels okay. So I think in that sense, also there's a mental component just to being okay with things feeling pretty uncomfortable.
Yep. Sounds right. And I think the other problem, and the reason people are probably generally conservative especially with the normal population, is there's a lot of confounding factors. It's probably hard to design a study that can really tease out what's the effect of cardiovascular fitness versus, well, some people just don't sleep well in general from time to time, or some people's appetites just aren't as regular as others. There's just a lot of factors involved in something, and it's also pretty subjective. Like, how do you feel today?
Right.
Some symptoms, I guess, you have a headache. Even headaches, right, have varying levels. But so I think these studies are always hard to design, because once you start talking about metabolism, the complexity goes off the charts. And that's fundamentally what you're talking about here. So you're trying to isolate one variable, your cardiovascular fitness, and saying, how does that affect your metabolism at altitude? It's a hard question, I think.
Yeah.
And yes, 23 people doesn't sound like nearly enough to make any significant conclusions. Okay.
I can't believe that all that conventional wisdom is based on one study of 23 people.
So I only spent about 20 minutes doing a literature review there.
Okay.
And I'm relying on articles that I can get access to without having any, institutional, journal access. So there may be others, but this was the one that, like, what I saw most pointed to.
Yeah.
I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah. It's, for a brief, really dweeby diversion, if you want to read about this, read Brian Arthur's work from the 1980s and 1990s. He's the economist and super smart guy who actually developed the idea of the tipping points in a formal way, positive reinforcement. And when you get the internet and you get ideas, there's a lot of positive reinforcement once an idea gets out there. Everybody just says, oh, look at that. And we can joke and say, well, it's on the internet, it's got to be true. But that's what people do. And so one person cites it, then another person cites it, then another person cites it. The ranking algorithms, because most people are starting to link to it and use it, start to give it more credibility, or at least rank it higher up in the search results. And before you know it, you've got what we call an echo chamber. You have a very narrow selection that's getting positively reinforced, and nobody takes the time to actually go back and check. It's like the 10,000 steps on the pedometer, right? Which was just an arbitrary thing that somebody came up with 50 years ago, and now everybody thinks that's the gold standard. It's actually not. In fact, now there are studies that have looked at the number of steps, and most of them come far away from 10,000 steps.
Wait, is it higher or lower? We're way off topic. I'm curious.
Most studies, and again, the studies are weak because this once again interacts with a lot of things, say between 7,000 and 8,000 steps. Beyond that, the average person doesn't get much benefit.
Oh, sick. I can cut my training load way down.
Great.
We're pretty sure you're not an average person at this point.
And the other thing is, all these articles are citing, Outside Magazine is citing this article and saying, fitness does not protect against this. And I'm sure that these studies' authors wouldn't say,
right,
physical fitness has no protective effect against these things. What they would say is, well, from our data, from these 26 people,
link.
we didn't find any correlation between these things. That's all you can conclude from that. But people who are not as scientifically literate will see that and just take it as, oh, yeah, there's no protective effect.
Right. Yet another problem, the clickbait problem, but we won't go there now. Looking at your recent Cotopaxi success, what aspects of your approach do you think others could safely adopt? So part of our public service to the community, and which ones require the experience that the two of you have had over the years?
So I think there's two really big things that we can, hopefully safely help people do. And again, the last thing we'll talk about here, we talked about at the beginning, but again, we'll kind of reiterate the actual serious safety concerns. One of those is about sleeping. And the other is about basically, how you progress upwards and how you exercise and stuff like that. So sleeping, I think, is a really interesting one because the conventional wisdom, again, we've said that a lot this episode. The conventional wisdom is that, if you're climbing a really big mountain or you're moving up in altitude, that you kind of want to gently move up and up and up and up until, you're pretty close to the top of the mountain. So like if you're climbing Aconcagua or you're climbing Mount Everest, you're sleeping at 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, even 8,000 meters. I know it's brutal before you actually make a summit bid. And to me, I almost never do that. And this is one of these things where, like, we talk about, I say do as I say, not as I do, where I actually apply this to my athletes and the groups that I lead and stuff like that. So for example, on the trip that we lead in the Atacama Desert in Chile, we go from sea level to 3,800 meters in one night. That's the beginning of the trip. First night we're at 3,800 meters. And then we actually try to never sleep higher than that for the entire trip. What we do is we go up high every day. So we climb high and sleep low. And that's kind of, I think, becoming a new accepted thing. But for a long time, especially on big mountains, that was not the thing. It was, you get this huge acclimatization benefit from going and sleeping up at 5,000 or 6,000 meters, and then you come down and recover. What I've found for myself, and I think Conor can speak to this too, is sleeping really high up is tremendously uncomfortable. And to me, it's a net negative on the body when you have such a bad night's sleep and such a miserable experience that even if you gain some small amount of acclimatization on a physiological sense, the overall detriment to your body from basically just having no rest that night and then having to go down and take a few days to recover, it's a net negative. It's not a good thing. And so I've had a lot of success with this, both with myself and with, again, lots and lots of people who I've brought to the mountains over many years at this point, where we almost never sleep higher than, base camp, whether that's in the Atacama or in Peru or in the Himalaya. Even Chris Fisher and I, when we were on Lhotse last year, we never slept higher than base camp. When I was on Manasa, we never slept higher than base camp. These are 8,000 meter mountains. These are really, really big mountains. And both of us summited without oxygen. So it's possible to do it. I think that one of the big things is, like, you have to be fit enough to cover more distance. So that is the caveat. And this is where I was talking about the fitness side. So I think this is another thing where if you can be fitter going up before altitude, it's going to have all these benefits. Not only are you going to acclimatize faster, maybe, but you're also just going to be able to cover more ground more quickly. And so it's going to reduce the need for those intermediary camps, especially in mountaineering. So you're able to do everything from base camp instead of having to go up to 6,000, come back down after, basically pulling an all-nighter, staring at the top of your tent, which is no fun. So yeah, that's my kind of thing that I would share with people is try and get super fit before you go up, and then think about, how can I do this mountain without ever sleeping higher than, the absolute minimum? What's the lowest I can possibly sleep while still being able to make trips up and down the mountain?
That's really interesting. It's almost like thinking of your fitness going into that as a sort of currency, and figuring out how you can then spend that currency, because it does seem like it can have kind of compounding effects where you now have this capability of covering more distance, which means that you can start lower, which means that you don't need to sleep higher, which means that you don't need to spend that time up there, which means that you can spend more time actually climbing and going high and doing more specific training, which makes you fit. It just kind of builds upon itself.
And there's a whole other piece, which is, guess what? If you have to sleep at 6,000 meters, you have to get all your stuff up to 6,000 meters. You got to bring a sleeping bag. You got to bring a stove. You got to bring food. You got to bring water sometimes. So not only is it, you actually have to go up there and sleep, but a lot of the time you're carrying 40, 50, 60 pounds on your back because you have to go carry all the stuff that you're going to bring up there, which versus if you're just going up there and then you're going to sit there and take some pictures and maybe sit for an hour or two and come down, all you need is a day pack, So it's a totally different experience.
Yeah, when we were at Cotopaxi, what we did, we slept at the lower lodge, which is about what is Tamapaxi at?
38, maybe 38.
Yeah, and then got up early, drove up to the parking lot, which is maybe a half-hour hike from like the high Refugio. And I guess what most people do is they sleep up there, which is much higher. It probably is really uncomfortable to sleep there. I went in there. There are no rooms. It's just like open stuff, and you can put down a sleeping bag somewhere. I don't recall the exact logistics of how most people do this, but when Tyler explained it to me, I was like, oh, that sounds terrible. Like, what
Yeah.
Why would you? You're basically you're getting a much worse night of sleep really high up to avoid like an extra like. I mean, let's say people are going significantly slower, like an extra
Maybe an
hour hike
Yeah.
from
Maybe.
the parking lot.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem worth it. It seems
Yep.
like some aspects of the sort of conventional wisdom that don't really stand up to scrutiny.
Yep. So
yeah,
anyways, long story short, my advice to our listeners as our public service announcement would be talk to your guides, talk to whoever is organizing your expedition, and ask like, okay, if you're sleeping high in the mountain, why are we sleeping up there? Is it possible to skip that camp and go from base camp to camp 3 or base camp to the summit? Think about those things, figure out what's required, what kind of fitness that would entail. Just don't just accept a schedule that's given to you, but actually, have a conversation with whoever is organizing it about what's possible.
So for our listeners who might be planning their own high altitude adventures, what warning signs should they absolutely not ignore, even when pushing boundaries?
Yeah, so I go over this with all of my groups, whether we're coming to Quito or the Himalaya. The number one thing is HAPE and HACE. That's what Conor talked about at the beginning, cerebral edema, pulmonary edema. And those are super serious, life-threatening conditions. So we laugh a lot about altitude and how like the crazy things we've done. But again, this is super serious. So, if you are seeing someone who is having trouble speaking, acting like they're drunk, wobbling around, or if you are seeing someone or have a serious cough that has like bloody phlegm in it, super gross, but that's what you're looking for. Or like if you put your ear on their back and you hear like a really deep wheezing sound, those are your really serious symptoms of HAPE and HACE. And those are going to be different than your normal acute mountain sickness, which again is like headache, nausea, loss of appetite, poor sleeping. Those things are normal. If it gets to the point where it's impacting your ability to speak, almost like you're having a stroke or something, if you're having those pulmonary symptoms, that's when you really want to seek help immediately and get down. And I'll just throw the legal caveat, we're not doctors, we're not medical professionals. Like, please seek out your own advice, talk to doctors, all that stuff. So yeah, that's your HAPE and HACE warning. Those are the really big things to look out for. And again, we're not medical professionals. We can't give legal advice. We obviously can't give legal advice. We also can't give medical advice. But yeah, talk to your doctors before you go up high. Listen to whoever's around you who knows what they're talking about, and have fun. Enjoy it and be safe in the mountains. That's the number one thing. So that's all I've got. Conor, thank you so much for being here, man. It's great to have you be a part of this. It was great to have you here. Climb Cotopaxi together last week, and I'll see you in a few weeks on my way to Nepal.
Oh, thank goodness. Can't come soon
Blessings.
enough.
I know.
Blessings.
Extremely blessed. All right. All right, guys.
Bye,
so guys, please send any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, hopes, dreams. You can send those to my email, ty@chosky.run, or DM me, Tyler Sanders, on Instagram. And remember, this is all multimedia. You can read my raw training logs on my blog at tylersanders.com, or get that delivered to your inbox via Substack at tylersanders.substack.com. Ty's Training is a Chosky Media production brought to you by Chosky Endurance Collective, the world's leader in online coaching, travel, and community for endurance athletes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you guys next week. Ciao.